Okay, let's go ahead and get started, everyone. It is my pleasure to kick off the most anticipated series, I think, in our forum history, at least if not one of the top. So before I introduce our speaker in a moment, I wanted to introduce myself. For anyone present who doesn't know me, I'm Pastor Dan Peterson of Queen Anne Lutheran Church. And this is our special series, Demons, Darkness, and the Devil, a title which by itself could be deconstructed if we had time. But Demons, Darkness, and the Devil. The topic is going to raise questions from three different religious traditions. The first we'll consider is a two-parter from our guest today. Then in week 3, we'll be joined by Father William Watson of Seattle University to talk about possession and exorcisms from a Roman Catholic perspective. And then in the 4th session of this series, I will talk about perspectives in the New Testament and then do a special analysis of the demonic using Lutheran categories today. So we have hopefully a pretty exciting series ahead of us. I wanted to say a few words about protocols first. The series will be recorded, which means that shortly after the forum ends each Sunday, you should be able to access the forum on our YouTube channel. Just go to Queen Anne Lutheran on YouTube and you'll find us there. So please know it will be recorded. The forums go for about an hour, so just after 10 o'clock we'll end things. If you have questions, you're welcome to ask Dr. Lawrence directly, or if you would like, you can simply type them in the chat field and I will ask on your behalf. And I think that's it. So, do evil spirits exist? Is Satan real? This series considers the topic, as I mentioned, from 4 different angles. Old Testament perspectives from Dr. Beatrice Lawrence, Catholic perspectives, and then New Testament Lutheran perspectives. So our speaker is Dr. Beatrice Lawrence, Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible at Seattle University, where she also teaches courses in Jewish studies. Her research interests are diverse, but she especially enjoys teaching. She's one of the best teachers I've ever met, and talking about diverse and complicated aspects of Judaism. I have learned so much about Judaism from her. I've also delighted in having her be a regular guest on God for Grownups, our podcast episodes, and a good friend. So I turn it now over to Dr. Lawrence for Demons, Darkness, and the Devil from a Jewish perspective.
Thank you, Pastor Dan. I am so delighted to see so many familiar faces. I wish I could be in the room with you and enjoy your presence, but I will totally take this. And I hope everybody is doing well. And I'm so grateful that I get to be here to talk about such a fun topic. And I was kind of tempted to show up and say, yeah, not so much, and then just end the Zoom meeting. But we're not going to do that. Because there is actually some material to talk about. But one of the reasons I thought about doing that is that questions about demons, evil, things like that, and Jewish tradition going all the way back to the Hebrew Bible are not so much about things that are outside the created realm, outside what God intended for creation. And as a part of an ancient Near Eastern context, actually, the ancient Israelites inherited a system whereby evil forces and demons are associated with regular difficulties that human beings face. And there's this really fun way that in this Canaanite system, it's weird that I just said fun, and I know that. That's a little messed up. So I guess what I mean is it's really interesting that, for example, the word reshef refers to pestilence. It refers to disease. And so the word reshef appears in relation to the idea of a plague, but it also becomes an embodied figure at some point. And so it simultaneously functions as something that happens to human beings and the force in and of itself. That kind of complexity is really what we have to face when we talk about all of this. And the idea that really is central is that evil comes from God. And that's something that we have to wrestle with. So I have a bunch of texts that I'd like to share with you today. We'll see how far we get with all of those. And depending on how far we get, the next time we meet on the 7th, I was thinking I could share with you some of the ways those ideas develop. I'd also really love for us to have a chance next time to talk about apocalyptic literature. This is literature that we date from about 200 BCE to 200 of the Common Era. And it starts out in a Jewish context and becomes predominantly Christian. And in this literature, you see the embodiment of evil forces as actual beings. So that is kind of a change. Now, Pastor Dan and I disagree about when this really becomes a central feature of Judaism. So we can talk about that next time. Or now, whatever you want. Okay, so how does that sound as sort of a, hey, this is what we're dealing with thing before we look at some texts? Okay, what I have pulled up here is Leviticus chapter 16. Leviticus is the flyover book of the Torah for a lot of people, but it's actually my favorite book of the Torah. And it's true that it contains a lot of information about sacrifices. And it's true that a lot of people don't feel super excited about sacrifices, but I think it's kind of fun. And what is being described in Leviticus chapter 16 is the ritual associated with Yom HaKippurim, which becomes Yom Kippur in Judaism. I want to be clear, there's no animal sacrifice in Judaism anymore. I have met many students who think we still sacrifice goats on Yom Kippur, and we don't. But in the biblical period, they did. And early in the ritual, the high priest Aaron would select 2 goats and would bring them to the tent of meeting, would bring them to the central location that people would come to offer sacrifices and engage with God. And he would set markers on them. One would be marked for God, and one would be marked for Azazel. Raises the question of what is Azazel, right? There's a horror movie about that too. I have a problem with horror movies. Pastor Dan knows this. Called Fallen with Denzel Washington and John Goodman, and I recommend it. Okay, so he marks one and he sacrifices the one marked for God and leaves the one marked for Azazel standing. A bunch of other sacrifices take place. And then what he does, I'm gonna scooch down here. After offering the sacrificing, and there's a bunch of blood and yada, 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 he's going to go to the remaining goat and put his hands on it and confess all the sins of the Israelites over it. And then it's sent off into the wilderness. Now, they wanted to make sure the goat with all the sins of the Israelites didn't come back into the camp. And so what we read in later texts about how they did this is they would have men stationed in the wilderness who would usher the goat along, and the last one would push it over a precipice so that it would die and take the sins with them. Okay, so of course the question that remains here is, who's Azazel, right? And ancient interpreters hated the idea that there was a power other than God, so they called it the wilderness and they called it all kinds of other things. But what they had to contend with is that this being, Azazel, is placed in parallelism with God, one goat for God, one goat for Azazel. And so they had to deal with whether or not this was an actual being, a being that would consume the sins of the people in the wilderness. To make things more complicated, later in Leviticus and in Isaiah, there's a reference to the Israelites worshiping hairy goat demons. And so we're left with this potential relation to a demon. Okay, questions about this thus far? Have you all heard this name before? Azazel?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so what you're sketching here is sort of the beginning of the first appearance of a demon in the Hebrew Bible. Is that what we're doing?
Yeah, the texts that I'm sharing today are not completely in chronological order or narrative order, but I did start with the earliest one.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
And so,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just going to say there's no explanation for it. There's no introduction. There's no, this is who this is, which is completely how the Hebrew Bible works.
Steve has a question. He says, are you saying Azazel was understood as an entity? Hold on. Entity, God, before it was a generic scapegoat?
That is what many people think. When they look at this and the other references to hairy goat demons, they think we're looking at an entity. We still have the origin of the concept of a scapegoat, right? In this very story, in that a goat carries all of the sins to this demon who then consumes it. So, but it seems to have that metaphysical level.
Is there any evidence to suggest, in terms of not chronological but narrative order of the Hebrew Bible, that sin itself appearing in Genesis 4 was ever personified as something evil as well, along with the development that you're sketching here?
Yeah, well, if you would like, pardon me for a minute. I can't tell if there are typos, but I would like to share this text with you. Okay, Genesis chapter 4 is a really interesting. I thought about, should we start here? But I was kind of thinking demon-wise. Genesis chapter 4 is the first reference to sin. It's the first time we see the word sin. And this is the famous story about Cain and Abel. I'm going to scooch down here. Of course, this is a famous story. But what happens is Cain and Abel each bring sacrifices to God, and God accepts Abel's favorably, but not Cain's. Cain is upset about this. And God says, why are you upset? If you do right, there's this strange phrase, there is uplift. It really means if you do right, you will be uplifted. You will emerge above it. But if you do not do right, it's interesting they capitalize sin here. Sin, it says couches at the door. You can also say crouches at the door. Its desire is for you, but you can rule over it. That's a more literal translation. So there, sin is actually waiting for you to be in such a position that you're going to give in. Now, does that render sin a being? That's a good question. What do y'all think? Pastor Dan, if you wanted to respond to that also, anyone?
Well, I think then, given the fact that it said it's clearly personified here. I mean, insofar as it's crouching at the door, it's pictured as the language, metaphorical or not, seems to be some kind of entification or personification of sin. The fact that the translators capitalize it, I think, is suggestive as well. But that may just represent their bias, if nothing else.
It is without a definite article in this case.
I'm really curious about this idea that you could be its master. Like, wow, what does that suggest?
You know, it's clear throughout the Hebrew Bible. I'm always loath to say something is 100% consistent because I feel like so few things are consistent in the Hebrew Bible. I feel like consistency is for pudding, not religious texts. But, and it's clear in Jewish interpretation that sin is perceived to be something that does not have power over you, but you can choose to have power over it. And this becomes a component of the theological anthropology in Judaism that I think in a different class we talked about a little bit, which is the idea that every human being has a good inclination and an evil inclination. And by the way, the rabbis build this, the later interpreters build this entire anthropology off of one letter. I love those guys. Anyway, and they, everyone has a good inclination and an evil inclination. And the good inclination is what moves us to commit acts of mercy and kindness and love and generosity. And the evil inclination motivates us towards lust and violence and selfishness and all of these things. And according to the rabbis, these are contained within you. They are not external forces. And you can choose how you enact these inclinations. So if you are experiencing the evil inclination, you have the power to choose if you're going to do something wrong with it or if you're going to use it in a positive way. So an example would be lust. If you're experiencing lust, which according to the rabbis is inevitable and a part of the intended creation, you can either participate in sex trafficking or on the other end of the spectrum, have a fulfilling sexual relationship with your partner. The latter is perceived to be a very good thing. And so you have a choice. Sin does not overcome us. And in fact, the rabbis believed we need the evil inclination. On the day that God created everything, God saw that it was good, right? That's Genesis 1. And God saw that it was good. And on the day God created the evil inclination, that's right, it came from God, God saw that it was very good. Because without it, nobody would procreate, nobody would be pushed to do something new. They said the world depends on rivalry, lust, and mercy. So all of this is necessary. How are we doing with that?
Good. There's a comment here by Jim Margard, which will take us back, I assume, to the Leviticus text. He says, interesting that in medieval Europe, the goat was often symbolic of the devil, most visible in Goya's black paintings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is an origin for that. I can't say it's the only origin for that, just because I haven't studied the history of the goat symbol as a demon, so I don't want to speak about that. But this does present a goat demon. And later Jewish interpreters really felt like that's what this depicts. But because of the idea that they didn't want to reference a being that also had power in competition with God's power, they had to kind of hide their opinions about it. There's a medieval commentator named Abraham Ibn Ezra who actually encoded in his interpretation to Leviticus this idea. And in commenting on this text in Leviticus, he said, the answer is, I can't remember, 32. It was a number. And if you count ahead that many numbers of verses, you get a reference to hairy goat demons. So this is consistently perceived to be a symbol of evil. Yeah. Nancy? Oh, sorry. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm struck with thinking of goats as being feeding people in ancient times, goat milk, goat meat. I mean, didn't they herd goats? It wasn't that their sustenance in their life, and the contrast with making the goat the place to place your evil. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, they did raise goats, and goats were not only food in a variety of ways, but goat skin was used, and goats were sacrificial animals as well. That is, God accepted goats in the sacrificial process. So it's hard for us to say that they were perceived to be wholly evil. That's one reason some people look at this particular text and say it has to be something else. It can't be a negative take on goats as a whole. Some people say it has to do with the hardiness of goats, their capacity to survive in the wilderness even without shepherding. So there are a lot of theories, but all of the theories are mountains suspended by a hair, as we say in biblical studies. We just don't have a ton of evidence. That's a great question. I see that there's more chats coming up here. I want to make sure I don't. When the ritual of, oh, yes, from Johnny. Yes, so does sin become a separate external entity? It appears in this text not to be an entity, but to be something that the goat carries away from the community. So sin is something that is committed by people, but they have a choice, and yet it has to be purged. Both things appear to be true. And Yom Kippur still has that meaning. We deal with our sins as we prepare for Yom Kippur. We seek forgiveness, we seek to make reparations. And then on Yom Kippur, we ask God for forgiveness for our sins. And it's through prayer and study that God wipes the slate clean. So it's no longer about carrying the sins off into the wilderness. But it appears to still be a sense of needing to wipe the slate clean, needing to get it out. It lingers in some ways. My synagogue in Atlanta, we used to show up for Rosh Hashanah with little slips of paper with sins written on them that we had committed. And then on Yom Kippur, 10 days later, the rabbi would read them out loud, not with names, but just so the whole community heard our sins. And then after Yom Kippur, we would burn them. That was a very tangible way that we were feeling that they were gone. When sin is committed, it's serious. It's very serious. But you don't have to commit all these sins, I think is the idea. Does that help a little bit?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Goats are stubborn and pushy. From Carol Ann. Yes, they are. I actually had a goat named after me in Atlanta. I don't know if they ate it. I don't know what they did with it, but they are. They're also hilarious. If anyone's ever had a goat, they make really good pets. They're smart and they're funny. So, but they have really weird pupils, and maybe that's one of the reasons they scared people. I don't know. There's one more here. From Steve. So no, the ancient Near Eastern context in which the Israelites lived and the reflections from texts like these, one of the things we have to be careful of is our view of the word demon. I feel like our contemporary context looks at the word demon and thinks something very particular.
Pete, could you repeat the question that he's asking for the recording?
Oh, yes. You're saying hairy goat demon, but it's my understanding demons didn't enter the Judahite imagination until after the exile. This is from Steve. Great question. When we think of demons, we have a particular set of expectations. Demons in the ancient Near East, in the Israelite context, there was a very thin line between a demon and a god. And in fact, there were references sometimes to good gods and sometimes to evil gods. And what demons could do, like I said earlier, sometimes had reference to human experiences that were negative. So we have to shed our understanding of the word demon and understand the limitations of English language to describe what I'm talking about. So they had power and they could do very negative things, but it didn't necessarily embody what we think of when we watch horror movies now. If anyone's familiar with the Arab conception of the jinn, this is a creature that has power. It doesn't necessarily get in the way of God's power. It's an old tribal idea that made its way into Muslim consciousness. And it's similar, that it has this power, but it is not, it's not embodied the way that we talk about. Now, Azazel appears to be either a location or an embodiment. But is it evil? The name Azazel means God is strong, actually. And what it's doing is consuming the sins that the Israelites need to get rid of. So is it helping? Right? I think that's sort of the question. Does that help at all? How are we doing?
Yeah, in a way, the goat isn't. I think we might be perceiving the goat as embodying evil and therefore being evil, but actually, the evil was actually sent into the goat, and the goat was able to absorb it and not be evil, but be this way of allowing us to purge, almost like compost or something. You know, like we're not like saying this detritus from the tree is evil and it's got to go. No, it absorbs into the ground. It actually becomes useful.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah. It is a scapegoat. And scapegoats do a job, right? They accomplish things. Okay. How are we doing? Should we move on to this one? Let me just fix my screen here for a second. There's another reference to goat demons. Can you all see Isaiah 34? Here? Everything's good? Everything's kosher? There is a reference again to goat demons greeting each other. And there's a reference to the Lilith or the Lilith. So these are two other figures that show up in the Hebrew Bible that are surrounded by a lot of mystery. So this word is the word for goat demons. Here's the problem. This word also just means hairy. And it also means goat. So it could be hairy goats greet each other, because there's actually a discussion happening in Isaiah in this spot about what the wilderness is like. Wilderness was a scary place in biblical Israel. You were at danger there. And hence hospitality and welcoming people in and taking care of them so they didn't have to be in the wilderness was a huge priority. But it's saying here, you know, wildcats and hyenas are not embodiments of evil. So why is this word translated as goat demons? The Lilith are creatures that we can't identify with contemporary creatures that appear to refer to a figure that lives in the wilderness and steals babies and becomes known as Lilith. If people here are familiar with Lilith. Okay. What have you heard about her besides Fraser Crane's wife? What have you all come across with Lilith? So you've heard of her, but let's see here. Oh, does the goat enable the ancient people to be evil? Okay, we'll go back to that in 1 second. Nancy's question is so great. Okay, did you say Cain's wife or Adam's first wife?
Adam's first wife.
Adam's first wife, right. Which Lilith Festival, woo! Okay, so the later Jewish interpreters, it's not in the Bible, identified Genesis 1 with Adam's first wife named Lilith and Genesis 2 with Adam's second wife named Eve. Who knew? And this has to do with the inconsistencies between the two creation stories and the fact that the creation of humanity appears twice. Okay. They too made her a demon, a baby stealing demon. So they built off of that biblical reference. And she appears to be almost a feminine force of chaos, threatening a primary feminine job, which is childbearing. Okay, she has been reclaimed as a feminist icon. And so we have Lilith Fair, we have Lilith, the feminist Jewish magazine, in part because, according to the rabbis, she left the Garden of Eden, and hence Adam needed a new wife because she was tired of his crap. She was like, I'm not going to do what you tell me to do. You constantly are telling me what to do. I've had enough of that. I'm leaving. God sends angels after her, and they say, come back. He's lonely. She's like, I don't care. I'm done. So God has to make Eve. So she's been reclaimed in this particular way, but she appears to be a dangerous figure who threatens a primary function of Israelite life. She was independent. Lilith Festival, Lucifer. Okay, can I just say one thing, y'all? Lucifer gives me a headache. That show throws so many theologies together sloppily, and it's like, I can't keep track. Okay. Also, I don't remember, who is Lilith in the show? It doesn't matter. I'm going to move on now. I'll go look it up. So I wanted to make sure to return to the questions here that I missed about the goat. About the Hindus, the early Hindus, the Indus Valley civilization, which is actually historically potentially a point of interest. Yes, there's a notion that creation and destruction are two sides of the same experience. And so the question is, could this relate to the two goats in which the strength of the benevolent deity is turbocharged by the presence of the force of the less benevolent one? That's such a beautiful question. And I would love for that to be how it works, but the problem is God in the Hebrew Bible is not always benevolent. God is willing to be God's own source of evil. But in this case, it might be a way to say, all right, I'm going to be here for you as you purge these things from your midst, and we're going to use this tool. It's interesting. Does the goat enable the ancient people to be evil because they can transmit their evil to the goat? So actually, there are a few categories of sin. Chet is a sin that you commit by accident and you seek forgiveness. Pesha is a sin that you commit on purpose and you cannot be forgiven. And then there are three categories of sin that retain their centrality in Judaism as unforgivable sins. Murder, incest, and idolatry. And I think we've talked about that in these sessions before. So there is an idea that you can cross the line you can't come back from. So it doesn't actually leave room for you to just do what you want. And in fact, the rabbis were troubled with this. And in the 2nd century of the Common Era, interpreting the Bible, they said, if a person says, I'll sin and then repent on Yom Kippur, I'll sin and then repent on Yom Kippur, they won't be forgiven on Yom Kippur. Their sins will not be forgiven. So there's great concern not to allow that to become the case. It's a beautiful question.
Hey,
yeah.
I don't want to take us off track. So if that's the case, then just let me know. But is it the case? What's the consequence? So in the Christian tradition, you can often appeal to hell as ultimate punishment for unforgivable sins, the only which is named in the New Testament as blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, and we don't quite know what that means. What are the consequences for not having your sin pardoned in Judaism? God upset with you, but when you die, right? I mean, what are the consequences?
Well, there are multiple afterlife concepts in Judaism. There are multiple afterlife concepts in the Hebrew Bible. The dominant one is that everybody goes to Sheol, which is like the underworld. It doesn't matter who you are or how you lived, right?
Right.
Later in Judaism, more ideas flourished, including ideas about punishment and reward. This might have to do with interaction with Christian communities, but no single view becomes dominant. Death is often the punishment.
Okay.
If you commit a certain sin. So David, for example, in 2 Samuel 11 and 12, steals a man's wife, gets her pregnant, and then has the man killed. And when God comes to him, David and says, I know what you did. David knows that the punishment is death. God remits the sin because God favors David. David's the favorite kid of the Hebrew Bible, and takes the punishment out on the baby that's born.
Right.
Right, the baby dies. So death is often the punishment. Social impact, that you'll be forced out of the community.
Mm-hmm.
For certain sins. But one of the ideas that then develops historically is that the idea that living in a good way is its own reward. And that living a good life has benefits. You can see this in Proverbs, actually, where wisdom is personified as a woman who says to people, if you live in the right way, you will have a good life. You'll have a good reputation. You'll be at peace, yada, yada. If you live in the wrong way, you're going to fall into danger and eventually die.
Right.
So does that sort of
Yep.
address what you're thinking? Okay.
Perfectly. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see what I pulled up next. Oh, I love this text. Okay. So I love this text because it often gets translated the way it is here, which sucks. And this shows up in liturgy in Judaism. I don't know if it shows up in liturgy in Christianity. Does it, Pastor Dan, this verse?
I don't recall it offhand.
Okay. What, you don't have all the liturgy memorized?
No, but I know this verse very well. It's one of my least favorites in the whole Hebrew Bible.
I'm so excited. All right. God talking through the prophet says, I create light and darkness. I create the well-being, peace, and I create evil. The word is evil. It gets translated as woe, but this word right here is evil. I am the Lord who makes all of these things, creates all of these things. I get frustrated when it's translated the way it is because I feel like it misses the sort of impact of the verse, which is saying that if there's really only one God in the universe and everything comes from God, then the buck stops there, and that has to include all the bad things. So what this does is take away the notion that there's another being responsible for the bad things. I see there is a comment or a question. Let me go back here. Okay, definitely conflicts with our view of a benevolent God. Yeah, if God is the source of everything, that definitely alters your theology. God can be benevolent. God can also be a real jerk in Jewish thought. And being angry at God is fully acceptable in a Jewish context. Yelling at God, if a human being has a moral compass that is better than God's, that human being needs to call God out. There's a story that a man goes up to the proverbial pearly gates on Yom Kippur, and he lists all of his sins. Or rather, God says to him, here are all the things you did wrong this year. And the man says, you're right. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. And then the man lists everything God did wrong that year. And God says, you're right. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. According to Elie Wiesel, it is a sin to let God off the hook. So I think this is a significant difference, would you say, between Jewish and Christian thought about God?
Oh yeah, yeah. It's also the way that Jack Miles in A Biography of God interprets the ending of Job. That in fact, what we realize is that Job, who I think fits the character or qualifies as someone with a moral compass better than God, that in the end, it's really about let me back up. When
we're going to look at Job. Should we go there?
Job gets everything back. Miles argues that is in fact a sign of God repenting to Job for what God has done to Job. So really,
yes. Do you want to go to Job?
Sure.
Job is a great text to look at when it comes to the question of evil, and also the question that you raised about Satan, because there is a figure in the beginning of Job called Ha-Satan. So the book starts out with Job being like ridiculously righteous, and he's really blessed, and he has all of these children and all of this wealth, and he worries not only about what they do, but what they think, and he's kind of the caricature of a pious man. And one day, the divine beings presented themselves before the Lord, and the adversary came with them. Adversary here is capitalized. This stands for Ha-Satan. I don't like the translation of adversary that's capitalized necessarily, but okay. No, actually, we can go with that. The word Satan here is the word that's right here. But it's not Satan because there's a definite article. This means the. So it's the verbal root Satan means to serve as an adversary. Okay, to be against. And it appears that when the divine beings gather with God to have conversations, he is among them. So he visits also. And it's so funny because God starts a conversation saying, where have you been? And the adversary says, been walking around on earth. The Hebrew word mithalech literally means walking around on earth. And the Lord says, have you noticed my servant Job? There's no one like him on earth, blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil. And the adversary is going to point out that, well, of course he's all good. You've given him everything. It's really easy when people are blessed for them to be very devoted to God. Prosperity gospel into that? Okay. And so he says, if you take away everything he has, he's going to change. He's going to blaspheme you. So God says, all right, go ahead. Just don't hurt him. Don't touch him. And so the adversary goes forward. We're going to skip to chapter 2. And actually, hold on one second, and actually takes away everything that Job has. And having trouble here. So Job actually just sits and grieves, having trouble getting to the next chapter, and says, this is how it's supposed to be. Next chapter, the adversary and the other divine beings are going to gather with God again. And God is going to say, have you noticed Job? God always brings up the conversation. I just want to point out who starts this. Okay. God starts by saying, have you noticed my servant Job? You took away everything that he has, or we did, and he is still righteous. He still does not blaspheme me. And the adversary says, well, if you afflict his body, then he will surely blaspheme you. And God says, okay, go ahead, afflict his body, but don't kill him. Why not kill him? Interesting. Because then the experiment can't continue. All right. So the adversary and God, they arrange for him to have boils all over his body, and he sits on a pile of ashes and scratches himself with a potsherd. Naked I came out of the womb, naked I'll go back. But starting in chapter 3, Job is going to, as we say in Yiddish, kvetch. And he's going to spend 30 some odd chapters lamenting what has happened to him and saying essentially that God is unjust. He's going to consistently say, I don't know why this is happening to me, but it's not fair. Job's friends are going to come visit. They're going to sit with him initially for 7 days in silence. And then they're going to start talking. And their responses to him are going to be, you must have done something. You must have done something wrong, or this would not be happening to you. And Job refuses to accept that. He says, no, 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 no. That is absolutely not the case. I did not do anything wrong. And I demand a day in court with my accuser. That is, I want God to tell me to my face what I could possibly be guilty of, such that this would happen to me. Let me check the chat. Whoa, are there multiple divine beings? Do you mean from the divine beings gathering with God? Yeah, so the language is confusing. The words translated as divine beings are B'nai Elohim, which means literally sons of God. And here I'm using literally corrected, right, Pastor Dan? When I say B'nai HaElohim literally means the sons of God.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, all right.
It's not for the sake of emphasis.
What'd you say?
It's not for the sake of emphasis.
No, it's for the sake of translation.
Exactly.
Okay.
You're
so
good.
Thank you. Okay. So and the question is, are these sons of God, or how does this happen? And again, the Canaanite context of the Israelites matters, because in their pantheon there was a head god named El, and he had kid gods with his consorts, and they were known as Baal and Anat and Mot, which is the same word for death, and he was the god of death. And by the way, Yahweh, which becomes the name for the Israelite deity. So is this some sort of reference to the Canaanite pantheon and that God had kids? Or is it the phrase that's used to describe beings that God created to serve God? Messengers God sends when there are things to be delivered, beings sent on tasks. Is that an example of what happens in Genesis 32 when Jacob wrestles someone all night? And so some people refer to this as a divine court and call these being angels. And Isaiah sort of describes that kind of environment. Okay. What differentiates blaspheming God and calling him out for sins? I think that's an excellent question because I always ask my students, did Job blaspheme? And they're torn. Because ultimately what Job is saying is that God is unjust. Does that count as blasphemy? Did he cross that line? When we get to Exodus, when we get to Job 42, excuse me a minute while I look up Job 42. This website that I'm looking at is amazing, by the way, and everybody should use it. Okay.
What is it?
Safaria is all, when I say everyone should use it, you don't need to, because it's all Jewish text.
Oh.
In Hebrew and English and Aramaic and okay. So God eventually does show up to respond to Job's demand to see his accuser. God offers a couple of speeches in response to Job's points. A lot of debate out there about the efficacy and meaning of those speeches. In a way, the speeches are, I'm God and you're not. Job says on more than one occasion, okay, sorry, I'll shut up now. But when we get to the beginning of Job 42, and I think you were referencing this, Pastor Dan, this Job 42.
Yeah.
When Job speaks back at God, first of all, I want to say that Job quotes God. And some people say, is that demonstrating that Job heard? Or is that snarky? Or somewhere in between? I had heard you with my ears, but now I see you with my eyes. This verse right here can be translated in multiple ways. And it sounds like Jack Miles translates it one way. I like the commentary by someone named Norman Hobble because he lists all of the possibilities. It can be a way of saying, oh, and this is therefore I recant and relent, being but dust and ashes. That can be a way of saying, I'm small, I take back what I said. It can also mean, therefore I am disgusted and I regret upon dust and ashes, which is very confusing. But this word does mean disgust, and this means regret, among other things. And some people wonder if it's Job's way of saying, I'm disgusted by your answers and I shouldn't have said anything. This hasn't helped. And anything in between. So it's very, very confusing. But God goes on and says, I'm incensed at you and your two friends, for you have not spoken the truth about me, as did my servant Job. Job has to offer sacrifices on their behalf. Of course, what the friends all said was there must be a reason. God doesn't do anything for no reason. And apparently they were wrong. And what Job said is God is being unjust. And apparently he was right. How are we doing with this? Oh, 5 comments. I missed them all. Is it blasphemy if it's the truth? Oh, Safaria. Is it blasphemy if it's the truth? I think that's a great question. What do you think? Is it blasphemous to say the truth?
I myself don't think so. Because we saw in the beginning obviously God, this was like an experiment. So we know what the truth was, even if Job didn't. And when Job gets to, his wit's end and calls him out, I think it's not blasphemy then. If that's the established relationship, that, it's okay to call God out and kind of question his reasons. Whereas what I understand about my Christian background, God, even if God is doing something that doesn't make sense, we're not supposed to question it. So we just take it. But I find in my everyday life, I have this problem. Is it wrong to question those above you? If it's the truth. How is that wrong to point to say, look, this isn't right? So I
hear you.
I see a parallel going on a bit there.
And yet, whose truth is it?
Well, I'm like, in this case, just talking about, we have facts. So we know that God and the adversary had this deal, and that's why Job is going through this. So this is a truth. But just to keep it, because otherwise then you go down the slope of, what is the truth? And well, you might think it's the truth, but you don't have facts about it. And, then could be blasphemy. But I think in this case, because there's facts, there's a fact showing up here. Even if Job doesn't necessarily know that, though.
In a Jewish context, there's a trust of human experience. There's a basic trust. If something bad happens to you, you're allowed to call it bad. I don't know if anyone here is works in mental health, but the DSM-V, whatever, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, whereby mental health professionals diagnose people's struggles psychologically. There's a version in Yiddish. Okay, the whole thing's not in Yiddish, but the ailments are Yiddish. And there's one on talking to yourself. And how do you know if it's a problem that you talk to yourself? I love this. And it said, well, are you talking to a dead relative? That's fine, right? That's totally fine. Are you yelling at God? Totally fine. Not a problem. And there's a description of a man yelling at God, you sadistic mamzer. I'm not going to tell you what the word mamzer means. I'll get kicked out and never brought back. But so I think there's a different way of looking at that. Mm-hmm. Robert Frost, I want to say, has an incredible poetic play called A Mask of Reason. And it is chapter 43 of the book of Job. And Pastor Dan, did you read this? I think I made.
Yeah, you mentioned it before, but I haven't read it.
Okay. And it was written in 1945. And it's a fascinating take on the aftermath of Job, because we're reading Job. We know what happened in the beginning. Job doesn't. We're screaming at the book, Job, this is being done to you, and he can't hear us, right? And we're suffering because of that. So it's chapter 43. Job and his wife are in the afterlife. God comes to visit to explain things 1,000 years after they died. And when God tells Job, this is why it happened, chapters 1 and 2, Job says, I expected more than I could understand, and what I got is actually less than I can understand. It's an amazing play. And then the devil shows up, but he looks like a diaphanous wasp. And Job says to God, what happened to him? And he goes, well, church neglect and metaphorical use have rendered him but a shadow of himself. Which I think is hilarious. Okay. Pastor Dan, how are we doing? Because
we're at 11. I say we go another 5 minutes, if that's okay. Since we
totally.
Started. Just really quick. Yeah. You use I'm assuming based just on Robert Frost's usage, but do you use the word devil and Satan here interchangeably?
He's called only devil in the Robert Frost bit.
Yeah.
In Jewish literature, as the character associated with the force of evil develops, he's called Belial, Mastema, Satan, Samael. I think those are, and he becomes associated with the evil inclination.
Okay.
And what that tells us is there's still an idea that he can't actually rule over you. Can only be an inclination.
So, and that association occurs in Judaism subsequent to the Hebrew Bible, in rabbinical Judaism? Okay.
Well, in apocalyptic literature, it's a being who does stuff, right? And then starting at around 200 of the Common Era, Judaism evolves away from the idea of it being a being and returns to an idea that it's an inclination.
Oh, wow. Huh.
A tendency. So I think apocalyptic retains its significance in Christianity more than it does in Judaism.
Yeah.
It becomes kind of a metaphor ultimately.
Yeah. Huh.
And by the way that you help tame your evil inclination is Torah study.
Can I add a comment here?
Please.
So I'm a Christian, but one of my best friends from college, she converted to Judaism, and she and I are actually studying the book of Amunah right now. And one of the things that she's pointed out to me and it's literally from the book of Job, that the book of Job is literally teaching us that God basically lays out every single step in your life, whether good or bad, but it's laid out for you to make your choices, the free will that we have. And that's what the whole point of the trials and tribulations of Job is, that God is the orchestrator of your life, but your decisions you have control over. So
interesting. That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Because Job chooses not to respond in a particular way.
Right.
Yeah. So all these things happen to him and he makes a choice how to respond.
Right. Because God is training us, if we are truly his children, to always seek what is the right decision, not the decision that feels right to us.
That's interesting. We have to think about what the word right means in that context.
How about godly? Let me say the godly decision.
That word is actually also not really at home in Judaism. That's really interesting though, because whatever happens to you, you make the choice about how to respond.
That's also very Buddhist kind of sentimentality too.
Oh, that's really interesting. I don't know how comforting it is, but it's interesting. I feel like so much of the Hebrew Bible is not comforting.
Well, what about the idea here, B, that that God orchestrated all of this? That seems to me to diverge a bit from what we have in the text, but I'd like to hear your view.
Would you say the adversary orchestrated it?
No, that each step is orchestrated by God, and I don't know if I'm mischaracterizing Benita's comments. It's really
No,
interesting.
that is correct. That's what she told me. And I've had over the last couple of months, that's been like I've been trying to wrap my mind around that too. Like I don't know how to. I'm still processing it.
Sure.
Yeah. And where does that, I guess my question would be, how do we arrive at that view based on our reading of this text? Where does that come from in the text? What evidence do we have for it? That's why I'm really curious now too.
Well, hang on. And this is, I think, because and it did not come from this particular text, but the Universal Garden of Amunah, which is by Rabbi Shalom Arush. And hang on, let's see. I'm gonna find exactly where he said that, but
all right. Well,
so it says that hang on.
how about Benita? How about we come back to that at the beginning of our next? We have one more session with B, and that way that'll give you time to find it, and we can come back to that next week. That sound all right?
That's great.
I really
Great.
appreciate the question you're asking, and I want to make sure it gets the
Yeah.
time it deserves. Bea, we're just about the end. Do you want to closing comments or?
I do, in the book of Job, I do hold God entirely responsible for what happens. God starts the conversation, like, what do you think was going to happen when he was like, look at my awesome guy? Like, there's no way this was going to go well. So I did want to point out really quickly to go along with Isaiah that the King Saul was subjected to an evil spirit from God once he made God angry. And so as we move forward in Jewish literature, we have to wrestle with the development of Jewish theology more in the direction of how do we describe reality and also see God positively. We have to deal with the idea of protest, but also demons, again, with that slightly different meaning, develop as figures associated with ailments. So there's a demon responsible for arthritis and responsible for stomach ailments and things like that. So it becomes a way for people to describe their experience of things that happen to them and where that comes from. So I look forward to sharing some of the later texts with folks, if that's okay. If we're game for that. Okay.
Great.
Thank you, Pastor Dan.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lawrence, for joining us for this first session of Demons, Darkness, and the Devil. We'll return next week with more, and it's great to see all of you here. Thanks for being with us. If you'd like to join us at 11:30 for our church coffee hour, the Zoom link is available on our website. And once again, you can find this and other videos of our forums at our YouTube channel, Queen Anne Lutheran.
Okay.
YouTube. So thank you all so much, and thank you, Bea, for being with us today.
Thank you.